I called a jade bracelet fake in front of my boss, and 3 seconds later the CEO walked in and said, quiet as a knife, "That cleaner you just humiliated is my mother." Have you ever felt a room fall through the floor while you're still standing in it? Yeah, that happened. And I was the intern in a thrifted blouse, the last person anyone expected to speak. My name is Olivia. If you've ever been the smallest person in a big room, if you've ever swallowed truth because survival felt safer, this one's for you. It started on my first day at Stone Enterprises. The doors sighed open like they knew my secret, that I'd polished my old flats until they shined, that I was betting everything on a fresh start. The receptionist barely glanced up, told me 10th floor, ask for Miss Sandra. I said thank you, the way girls from open-air markets say it, soft and careful, and rode the elevator up with my heart kicking my ribs. Sandra's office was glass and gold letters, the kind of corner that believes in itself. She wore a red blazer that could cut a person and a smile she never used. "You're the intern," she said like it was a diagnosis. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She stacked 20 copies in my arms like bricks and waved me off. On my way to the copier, I passed an older woman, back a little bent, wearing an oversized cleaning uniform scarf, tied neat over gray hair, humming as she swept up other people's mess. People flowed around her like water around a rock. A man muttered, "They should retire, these old people." And the group laughed. I didn't. I stopped and said, "Good morning, Ma," asked if she needed anything. She looked up, surprised eyes kind, and said, "No, but thank you." If you've ever felt seen by someone who usually gets ignored, you know that small brightness that stays with you. The next morning, the office was a beehive. Printer's heels, coffee, 1,000 small storms. The cleaner was mopping near design. Sandra stood nearby with a paper cup, narrowed her eyes, and tilted the cup so water slid across the floor like a dare. "What a mess," she sang. "You should clean that up, that's what you're paid for." Then she went in sharper, old, slow in the way, like aging itself was offensive. My chest got hot. I stepped forward. "Miss Sandra," I said, not loud, just steady, "that isn't fair. You poured the water on purpose." Her head snapped toward me. "Look at that, the intern found a voice," she said, and then her jade bracelet slipped from her wrist and shattered on the tile with a sound that made everyone flinch. She pointed at the cleaner. "Do you know how much this costs, Ice Jade? 28,000. You will pay for it." The cleaner's hands trembled as she crouched, trying to make herself small. My mother once sold stones on a folding table at the market. Nothing fancy, just enough to teach me the difference between what's real and what's pretending. I picked up a shard, turned it in my fingers, felt the weight, saw the flat color. "With respect," I said, "real jade doesn't break like this. It has natural lines. This looks like glass." The room froze. Sandra's eyes went cold. "You little rat. You think you know more than me? You're just an intern." People stared at screens that weren't on. We all know that cowardice. I held the shard and tried not to shake. "It's wrong to blame her for something she didn't do," I said. Sandra snapped for security. "Throw them both out." The guards came, both apologetic and trapped. A radio crackled. The elevator dinged. The hallway adjusted itself like a spine straightening. Alexander Johnson stepped out in a deep blue suit, the kind that fits like certainty. His gaze moved over the scene, the water, the pieces, the cleaner me. And when his eyes found the older woman, something changed in his face like a light switched on behind glass. He touched her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded. He turned to the guard. "Who told you to remove her?" Miss Sandra. The guard swallowed. His voice stayed soft, but the room leaned in to hear. This woman is my mother. If it were you, would you keep quiet to save your job, or say the thing that burns your tongue? Here's the part I didn't tell anyone that day. 2 months earlier, I woke up in a hotel room I didn't recognize. My mouth tasted like metal, my head pounded, my bag was gone. A fight with my mother and my sister Bella flashed in fragments. Drink the juice, relax, why are you so stubborn? And then nothing. The lock turned and I braced myself, but the man who walked in was not the one I feared. It was Alexander, the CEO of the company where I'd just won an internship, looking confused like he'd been sent to the wrong life. He took in the scene, dress still on eyes blown wide with fear, and he didn't make me smaller. He called someone low and controlled, then pulled a black card from his wallet and set it on the bed. "There's $2 million on this," he said. "Take what you need and leave." I said I only needed 50,000 because that's what they had tried to sell me for, and that's what it would take to get them out of my throat. He watched me like a person looks over a cliff. Then he said, "My mother keeps trying to marry me off. I've avoided every girl she brings. If I ever did it, I'd want someone honest. If I offered marriage in name only, protection, no expectations, would you accept?" I asked him to keep it secret. Let me finish school, let me work, let me stand on my own. He nodded. We signed papers with no ring, no ceremony, just ink and a promise to stay out of each other's way unless the world required a performance. Back to the hallway. Grace, that's her name, stood with a mop and a patience older than the building. Alexander's jaw worked as he listened to what had happened. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He thanked me for telling the truth. My mouth barely worked when I tried to answer. Later upstairs, he shut his office door, and his mother peeled off her gloves, folded them neatly, and said the thing he was trying not to hear. "You got married in secret." He winced and then nodded. She told him she wanted to see me herself, without title, without anyone performing kindness for a Johnson. "She didn't know who I was," Grace said, "and she was kind anyway." That matters. She invited me to stay at the house. Quietly, no announcements. And every morning I still came in early, answered emails, did the work. Nobody fights to claim. In the evenings, a man named Mr. Francis Coleman began teaching me about antiques. He had the kind of presence that makes noise sit down. He set 2 jade pieces on velvet and told me to choose the real one. I didn't overthink it. I watched the light, felt the weight, found the tiny green cloud at the core. "This one," I said. He nodded. "You have the eye," he murmured like he was remembering someone. Grace's birthday came. Chandeliers, strings, perfumes that cost rent. I wore a simple gown she had laid out on my bed with a note in tidy script. I brought her a jade belt hook that Mr. Francis guided me to find. Not flashy, just right. She opened the velvet box and gasped the way people gasp when they see something true. Then Sandra floated in on a wave of green satin with a brighter belt hook and a borrowed expert named Mr. Andrew, who declared loudly that hers was 100% genuine. Heads tilted toward money like flowers toward the sun. And then a voice from the back said, "Let a real expert speak." And Mr. Francis walked into the light, examined both, and said mine was rare and genuine, and the other was counterfeit. You could feel Sandra's smile crack like paint. If it were you, would you have smiled back, or let that small, guilty satisfaction warm you for a minute? Stick around, because what happened next will blow your mind. Bella, my sister, or the person I thought was my sister, arrived at the mansion with a photograph so worn the edges looked chewed by time. She said she'd discovered she was adopted, that Mr. Francis was her real father, that she was Tracy, the little girl who vanished 20 years ago. His hands trembled when he held the photo, his mouth shaped a name he'd buried under years, and I watched a man who never lost his composure lose it. He moved Bella into his estate that evening, called her Tracy, began speaking in words like legacy, heirs, the future. Grace watched with a stillness I've learned to trust, and suggested a DNA test, not to hurt, to be sure. He agreed reluctantly because hope makes a person reach for paper. What none of us saw was Victor, Alexander's younger brother, a man who always stood in the shadow looking for a light switch, cutting a deal with Bella. He promised he could tilt results. He promised her a life that wasn't hers. He promised himself revenge. So the paper came back and told a story that felt good to believe. 99.9%. And Mr. Francis cried over numbers someone had bought. Meanwhile, at work, Sandra tried to keep me small with little knives disguised as tasks. Coffee from across the street. She'd purr and laughter would trickle until Alexander stepped into the doorway and said flat, "She's here to design, not fetch. If you want coffee, get it yourself." You could hear the room inhale. My chest did something embarrassing and warm. The company's charity auction was a golden hurricane. Cameras, gowns, voices soft as velvet until the bidding started. Bella took the microphone and told a story about family and miracles, and that moment when life finally makes sense then pulled me onto the stage with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Olivia has been spending so much time with my father," she said, "copying my interests. Pretending can only last so long." Before my pulse could find a rhythm, Alexander stepped out of the crowd with a sealed envelope, the kind everyone recognizes from TV. "You want truth," he said. "Let's have truth." He opened the paper and read without heat. "This is a certified DNA test comparing Mr. Francis Coleman to Bella and to Olivia. Result: Olivia Johnson is a 99.9% match. Bella Benson is not related." The ballroom went quiet in that expensive way. Mr. Francis stood like a man who had been underwater and finally found air, climbed the steps, and pulled me into his arms. "My daughter," he whispered into my hair, and the floor steadied under my feet. "Do you think that's fair? To trust paper more than the ache in a man's chest? Or is paper exactly what protects us when performance gets loud?" We thought the storm was over. It wasn't. That night, Grace collapsed at the dinner table, spoon falling from her fingers. The doctor said poison. The staff whispered my name. I had served the soup. Sometimes the easiest story is the one people grab first. Alexander looked at me, torn between rage and strategy, and said quietly, "I know," but he didn't defend me in the room, not yet. He was building proof. An aide packed a small bag for my safety, and I walked out of a house that had started to feel like prayer. Back at my father's estate, my father, I was still learning the shape of that word. I drowned myself in work. We restored a dynasty painting mixed pigments until my hands smelled like history, and Mr. Francis watched me the way a person watches a familiar melody return. He pulled Alexander aside one evening and said he felt certain in his bones. Alexander didn't argue with bones, but he did argue with forgery, so he ran a quiet test that contradicted the rigged result. Then his assistant filmed Victor in a shadowed alley paying the housekeeper who had slipped the poison and told her to disappear. Cash in an envelope. A voice on a recording. A trap sprung by the truth. The family meeting was a cold thing under bright lights. Staff lined the walls. Lawyers sat with their pens like swords. The screen played the video. Victor's smirk died slowly. Grace stood weak but steady and said, "You nearly killed me and framed my daughter-in-law." He shouted about favoritism, about living in his brother's shadow, about me getting everything he deserved. She cut him off. "You don't see your mistake," she said, and instructed the lawyer to remove him from the inheritance. Half her shares to Alexander, half to me. Gasps, then silence. Security escorted Victor out as he shouted something about regret. That night I sat on my bed with a pen and wrote divorce on a clean envelope. Not because I didn't love him. I did in a way I didn't know how to admit. But because silence can be a kind of betrayal too, and for a minute it felt like he had chosen patience over me. Then a text came from Sandra. "Emergency meeting, client crisis, we need you." Another text followed using my father's name, asking for my evaluation notes. I messaged Alexander, "Something urgent, please wait for me," and took a cab. A black SUV settled into my shadow. The building was nearly empty. My phone buzzed once, then died. A cloth. A smell. The floor left me. When the world returned, I was tied to a chair under a buzzing bulb, and 3 faces were lined up like a bad dream that had been rehearsed. Bella's smile was a blade. "You stole my life," she hissed. Sandra folded her arms and called me a charity case. Victor said he wanted Alex to feel what it was to lose. 2 masked men stepped forward with intentions that still make my throat close. Do you think that's fair? The way envy dresses itself in logic and calls it justice. The warehouse door exploded inward. Boots. Voices. "Drop your weapons!" Alexander walked in last, face carved out of steel eyes, dark with something I still don't have words for. "Touch her again," he said to the room, "and I'll end you myself." They dragged the men away in cuffs. He cut my ropes with his own hands, and I folded into him like a person who'd been holding herself together for too long. Back at the mansion, Grace put her hand on my cheek, called me child. Mr. Francis said, "You're home," over and over like a blessing. I slept. The next night, the garden was all lanterns and soft music, like the world was apologizing. A small table under a tree wrapped in lights. No grand gestures, just the right ones. Alexander pulled out my chair, sat with me in the hush, and then went to one knee. No ring, just honesty. "I've loved you since that night in the hotel room," he said. "I stayed quiet because I thought maybe you didn't, but I can't pretend anymore." I broke in the best way. "I love you too," I said. "I always have." And we held on while the air learned a new shape. A few days later, we walked into Stone Enterprises together. People tried to look busy while they stared. Alexander's voice carried clean. He announced Sandra's firing and pending charges. He said cruelty dressed as standards would never be culture here again. Then he took my hand and said the words out loud so the marble could hear. "This is Mrs. Olivia Johnson, my wife and the daughter of Mr. Francis Coleman." The room froze, then clapped, because some truths knock the wind out of people before they clap. I didn't smile big. I just breathed and let my shoulders come down. At the gate, before we left for our honeymoon, Grace hugged me long. "You offered to help me without knowing who I was," she whispered. "That's how I knew who you were." She told her son to take care of me, and he said he would like it was a vow he'd already started keeping. We drove off under a sky that finally looked kind. Now here's where I leave you with something messy on purpose. Was Grace right to test people by becoming invisible? Is it fair to hide power to judge character? Or does that just prove we treat people differently when we think no one important is watching? Do secret marriages count as protection or deception? And who gets to decide when protection becomes a lie? When blood meets paper, which one makes a family? The ache that never left, or the numbers that refused to bend. And the big one, do we really value honesty and work, or just the performance of both until a scandal forces us to pick a side? Tell me where you're watching from and your local time. I want to see how far this story traveled. If it were you, would you have spoken up for the cleaner on day one, or kept your head down? Would you forgive Bella if she said she was raised on scarcity and lies? Or does accountability mean you sit with consequences, no matter your origin story? Do you think Victor was a villain, or just a case study in how families make shadows, and then blame the people who grow inside them? Drop your take in the comments. Agree, disagree, argue with me if you need to, and tell me the one moment you would have handled differently. If you've ever been the invisible person in someone else's office, tell me how you kept your dignity. If you've ever been the Sandra for a minute, brave enough to admit it, tell me what changed you. And if this story hits somewhere real hit, like share it with the one friend who always spots the fake jade, and subscribe for more true feeling stories about power, kindness, and the price of pretending. Stick around. The next chapter is already knocking. You know what I mean.